Edward Muhl's office at Universal Pictures was the very symbol of Hollywood power. On the top floor of a three-story building, two secretaries guarded the door. Getting inside required more than an appointment. You needed an invitation. The walls were covered with Oscar statuettes and sign posters. From a massive window behind his desk, the entire studio complex spread out before him. When Muhl sat there, he could see every corner of Universal. That's why in February 1960, it didn't take him long to notice something was going terribly wrong on the Spartacus set. The budget had quadrupled. The director had been replaced. Kirk Douglas was no longer responding to his reports. Muhl's morning meeting notes contained one sentence: bring Douglas under control or shut down the project. But that same morning, Kirk Douglas's assistant delivered a message to Muhl's secretary. Mr. Douglas urgently needs to meet with Mr. Muhl. He expects a response within 6 days. The final sentence made the color drain from Muhl's face. Or we'll be speaking with other people. Before we continue with this story, please hit that subscribe button. The content we create takes extensive research, and your support helps us bring you more untold Hollywood stories like this one. In 1960, Edward Muhl wasn't just another studio executive. He was one of the most feared men in Hollywood, a position he had clawed his way into over 23 years at Universal. People who worked under him described a man who never raised his voice because he never needed to. His power was absolute, his decisions final. When Muhl approved a project, careers were made. When he killed one, millions of dollars vanished overnight and reputations crumbled. The studio system of old Hollywood gave men like Muhl control that today's executives could only dream of. Contracts bound actors, directors, and writers to studios for years. A single phone call from Muhl could blacklist someone from every major studio in town. This was the world Kirk Douglas had entered when he signed the deal to produce and star in Spartacus. And it was the world he was about to shatter. That decision was Kirk Douglas's first declaration of independence, and Edward Muhl hated it. Studio heads didn't just dislike being circumvented. They saw it as a threat to the entire system. If one star could fire and hire directors without studio approval, what was next? Would actors start choosing their own scripts, their own co-stars, their own release dates? Muhl had allowed Douglas unusual freedom with Spartacus because the star had invested his own money, but firing man without consultation crossed a line. The studio chief began watching the production more carefully, and what he saw disturbed him deeply. Costs were spiraling. Kubrick was shooting take after take, demanding perfection. The elaborate battle sequences required thousands of extras. The set construction was running months behind schedule. By January 1960, the budget had reached $12 million, and the film was only halfway complete. Muhl called Douglas in his office 3 times that month. Each meeting grew more tense than the last. What Edward Muhl didn't know was that Kirk Douglas had been documenting everything. Every conversation, every budget meeting, every decision made by Universal executives. Douglas had learned early in his career that in Hollywood, information was currency, and he was building a vault. His assistant kept meticulous records of who said what and when. Douglas had hired a private accountant to track where every dollar of the Spartacus budget was going, separating the costs he controlled from the costs Universal imposed. And most importantly, Douglas had been having quiet conversations with other executives at Universal, people who worked under Muhl, people who had their own grievances with the studio chief's management style. These conversations revealed something Kirk Douglas found fascinating. Edward Muhl had enemies inside his own house. On the morning of February 9th, Kirk Douglas sat in his home office in Beverly Hills, staring at a folder that had arrived the previous evening. The return address was from a law firm he didn't recognize. Inside were documents that changed everything. Financial record from Universal Pictures spanning the past 5 years, specifically detailing projects that had mysteriously gone over budget, projects where money had been diverted, projects where Edward Muhl had personally benefited from cost overruns through shell companies and creative accounting. The documents were devastating. They showed a pattern of corruption that, if exposed, wouldn't just end Muhl's career, but could trigger investigations into the entire studio system. Douglas didn't know who had sent the file, though he suspected it came from someone inside Universal's accounting department, someone who had finally had enough. The timing was perfect. Muhl was planning to shut down Spartacus within days. Douglas now had the ammunition to destroy him first. But Kirk Douglas faced a profound dilemma. Using these documents meant going to war with the entire studio system. Douglas's lawyer immediately advised destroying them. "You use this, Kirk, and you'll never work in this town again," Norton had said. Douglas listened patiently, then asked, "And if I don't use it?" Because if Douglas didn't act, Spartacus would be shut down, he would lose millions, and Muhl would ensure he never had creative control again. Douglas was 43 years old, at the peak of his career, staring at two paths: safety and submission, or total war. Kirk Douglas made his decision in about 30 seconds. He called his assistant and dictated the message that would be delivered to Muhl's office that morning. 6 days. That was how long he would give Universal's chief to meet with him, review certain documents, and come to an arrangement. The number was carefully chosen. 6 days was long enough for Muhl to feel the pressure building, short enough that he couldn't organize a proper defense. Douglas knew from his conversations with Muhl's subordinates that the studio chief was scheduled to present the quarterly financial report to Universal's board of directors in exactly 1 week. If these documents reached the board before that meeting, Muhl would be finished. The message Douglas sent wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum disguised in polite corporate language, and both men knew exactly what it meant. Edward Muhl received the message at 10:30 that morning. His secretary brought it in on a silver tray, as she did with all important correspondence. Muhl read it twice, his expression never changing, then dismissed his secretary and sat alone in his office for nearly an hour. People who saw him emerge said he looked older somehow, as if he had aged years in that short time. He made 3 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to his own lawyer. The second was to the head of Universal's parent company. The third was to a private investigator he had used before for delicate matters. By evening, Muhl understood that Kirk Douglas wasn't bluffing. The star had something real, something dangerous, and he was prepared to use it. The question was what Muhl would do in response. On the third day, something unexpected happened. Kirk Douglas received a call at home at 6 in the morning. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, a man who identified himself only as a representative of certain interests at Universal. He suggested a meeting somewhere private, away from the studio. Douglas agreed immediately, recognizing this for what it was. Someone was trying to negotiate without Muhl's knowledge. They met at a restaurant in Malibu, a place far from Hollywood's usual haunts. The man turned out to be Gerald Keller, a senior vice president at Universal who had worked his way up through the accounting department over 15 years. Keller was direct in a way that surprised Douglas. "Eddie Muhl is going to try to destroy those documents and destroy you along with them," Keller said quietly over coffee. "He's already hired people to dig into your finances, your personal life, anything he can use. But here's what you need to understand. There are people at Universal who want Muhl gone. He's been a problem for years. If you push this the right way, you won't be fighting alone." Kirk Douglas listened carefully as Keller laid out the internal politics of Universal Pictures. Edward Muhl had built his power base over 2 decades, but he had also made enemies. He had a habit of taking credit for successful projects while blaming failures on subordinates. He had blocked promotions, stolen ideas, and enriched himself while others struggled. The board of directors tolerated him because he had delivered profits, but profit margins were shrinking and Muhl's rivals were circling. What Keller was suggesting was a coordinated attack. If Douglas presented his evidence at the right moment, to the right people, with internal support already organized, Muhl wouldn't just lose his job. He would be completely destroyed, his reputation shattered so thoroughly that no studio would ever hire him again. Douglas asked the obvious question, "What do you get out of this?" Keller's answer was simple: Muhl's job, and a studio that makes better films with people who respect talent instead of crushing it. Douglas wasn't just fighting one man anymore. He was part of a larger conspiracy. Over the next 2 days, he contacted 5 senior executives who had suffered under Muhl's regime. They coordinated their approach with military precision. Documents would be presented not to Muhl directly, but to the board of directors. Multiple copies would be distributed simultaneously, making it impossible for Muhl to suppress them. And the presentation would happen not in 6 days, but in 4, catching Muhl before he could mount an effective defense. The night before the board meeting, Kirk Douglas barely slept. He kept thinking about what this moment meant, not just for Spartacus, but for Hollywood itself. The studio system was already cracking. Television was stealing audiences. Independent producers were gaining power. Stars were forming their own companies. What Douglas was about to do would accelerate that transformation. If he succeeded in removing Edward Muhl using evidence of corruption and by appealing directly to the board over a studio chief's head, it would establish a new precedent. Stars could fight back. Creative people could challenge executive power. The old system where studio bosses ruled like kings would be forever weakened. Douglas wasn't naive enough to think he was fighting for some noble cause. This was about his film, his money, his career. But he understood that his personal battle was part of something larger, something that would reshape the industry whether he wanted it to or not. The Universal Board of Directors meeting took place on February 15, 1960, in a conference room that overlooked the studio lot. 8 board members were present, along with Edward Muhl and 3 of his senior executives. Kirk Douglas was not invited, but he didn't need to be there. Gerald Keller and his allies had arranged for the documents to be included in the board's materials, presented as part of a routine audit review. By the time Muhl realized what was happening, it was too late. The board members had the evidence in front of them. 5 years of financial irregularities, shell companies that funneled studio money into Muhl's personal accounts, projects that had been deliberately sabotaged to benefit Muhl's outside business interests. The numbers were devastating. Over 5 years, Muhl had diverted nearly $3 million from Universal's budget through various schemes, a fortune in 1960 money that represented the cost of multiple major films. Edward Muhl's defense lasted less than an hour. He claimed the documents were forgeries, that Kirk Douglas had manufactured them as revenge for being kept under control. He suggested that Douglas was in league with communists, a serious accusation in 1960 that might have worked except for one problem. The documents weren't Douglas's. They had come from inside Universal's own accounting department, and Keller had 3 accountants ready to testify that every number was verified and real. When Muhl tried to deflect blame to subordinates, those same subordinates presented evidence that every decision had been made with Muhl's direct approval and often at his explicit instruction. The board members listened in increasingly stony silence as the facade of Edward Muhl's competent management crumbled before them. By noon, they had voted unanimously to remove him as studio chief, effective immediately. By 2 that afternoon, security was escorting him from his office. Kirk Douglas learned of Muhl's removal through a phone call from Gerald Keller. "It's done," Keller said simply. "Spartacus has full studio support. Whatever you need to finish the film." Douglas's first emotion was relief, so profound he had to sit down. His second emotion was something more complex, a mixture of triumph and unease. He had won, but in winning he had helped destroy a man's career and reputation, however much that man might have deserved it. Douglas thought about Edward Muhl sitting in his now empty office, packing his personal belongings while security watched, and he felt no satisfaction. This wasn't a victory to celebrate. It was simply something that had needed to happen. Hollywood had changed that day, shifted in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years. The balance of power between stars and studios had moved, just slightly, in a new direction. Spartacus was completed with full studio support over the next 4 months. The film premiered in October 1960 to massive acclaim, earning back its enormous budget and becoming one of the most successful films of the year. Kirk Douglas received credit not just as the star, but as the driving force who had refused to let the project die. What most people never knew was the battle that had been fought behind the scenes, the documents that had destroyed a studio chief, the conspiracy that had reshaped Universal Pictures' leadership. Gerald Keller did indeed become the new head of Universal, a position he would hold for the next 8 years. Under his leadership, the studio embraced a new model that gave more creative control to producers and stars, acknowledging the reality that power in Hollywood was no longer concentrated solely in executive offices. Edward Muhl never worked in Hollywood again. No studio would touch him. He spent his remaining years watching the world he once controlled continue without him. Years later, when film historians began examining the decline of the studio system and the rise of independent production, they would point to various factors: television, changing audience tastes, antitrust rulings. Few knew that one of the critical turning points had happened in 6 days in February 1960, when a star refused to back down and a studio chief fell from power. Kirk Douglas lived another 60 years after Spartacus, making dozens more films, winning honors and awards, becoming one of Hollywood's elder statesmen. But he always said that the fight for Spartacus was the most important battle of his career, not because of the film itself, but because of what it represented. He had proven that creative people could stand up to corporate power, that talent could fight back against executive control. The cost had been high. He had made enemies, revealed his capacity for ruthlessness, shown that he would go to any length to protect his work. But he had also established something new: the possibility that artists could maintain control over their own creations, that the old system of absolute studio dominance could be challenged and defeated. The 6 days that destroyed Edward Muhl were the same 6 days that liberated Kirk Douglas. In Hollywood's history, they marked a turning point from one era to another, from the age of studio chiefs to the age of star power. And it had all begun with a simple message, a 6-day deadline, and a folder full of documents that exposed the corruption at the heart of the old system. Power in Hollywood would never work quite the same way again.